Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and today we'll be exploring paradigms of consciousness. With me is Dr. Vernon Neppe, a neuropsychiatrist, forensic psychiatrist, behavioral neurobiologist, and author with physicist Edward Close of a book called Reality Begins with Consciousness. He has also written Cry, the Beloved Mind. Welcome, Vernon.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I guess it's fair to call you a polymath. You've published in many different professional areas, ranging from spirituality to neurobiology. And in each of these different areas, consciousness is defined differently.
That is true.
How do you deal with that?
The first thing I do is I use the words from the framework of or relative to. And so from the framework of neurology, consciousness is very different than the framework of psychology, of quantum researchers, of those who are involved in terms of levels of spirituality. And so it's all relative. And it's all from that framework, and I've got to recognize that that word consciousness is used in very, very different senses.
And yet we have, for example, journals for the scientific study of consciousness, and conferences, and institutes, and so on. And I found at some of these conferences you have people talking right past each other because they're defining consciousness quite differently.
Yes, and some have argued that consciousness is the hardest word of all to define.
Others have argued it doesn't even exist.
True.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the neurological understanding of consciousness, as I know that's one of your areas of expertise.
Well, from a neurological point of view, in other words, we're dealing with the nervous system and particularly the brain. We have terms like levels of consciousness. And obviously one can be in clear consciousness or at some level of clouded consciousness. And that clouded consciousness can move all the way through to deep coma. And one very often will define it in terms of awareness and response. And how aware are you? Are you clear in terms of that awareness? And is one able to respond to stimuli and different levels of stimuli, ranging from the most painful of stimuli to little touches? And so the whole fabric of consciousness neurologically, I think, is expressed in terms of awareness and responsiveness.
And basically the idea is you're often looking for neurological impairment to see if that's also reflected in the impairment of responsiveness or the impairment of consciousness.
Yes, and obviously one has scales in terms of extent of impairment, and you want to know, has that level of consciousness changed in some kind of way? But it's all an expression of brain function and how impaired that brain function is. And to some degree, there's a linearity there going all the way through from deep coma to clear consciousness.
But basically, the idea is if the brain or the nerves are impaired, then consciousness will be.
It will be, or it can be. Not necessarily will be. There are the subtle deviations, the subtle interpretations of what constitutes impairments of consciousness. And in that context, we also have the neurological consciousness as the end point of expression of probably all the other kinds of consciousness in a living, sentient being.
Well, there's a famous case, I think, from the 19th century of a railroad worker who ended up with a railroad spike right through his brain. And as I recall, he functioned quite normally.
Yeah, it depends where, of course, and it depends what one calls normal. And, one of the things I wrote in one of my plays, I'm also a playwright, is the patient says, "Doctor, what is normal?" And I say, a normal person is somebody you do not know very well. So we don't know how normally he functioned, but the point about it is there is a lot of potential in terms of compensation from a brain function point of view, and it's unfortunate that that compensatory component is sometimes ignored. We say, well, he suffered brain damage in X area, an X focal area, or it might be more general, but one does not realize that there might be compensations that are occurring elsewhere.
Well, the brain seems to be, especially in younger people, very adept at compensating.
Very much so, and we now talk about cerebral plasticity.
Yes.
When I was initially trained, you have damaged your brain, that's it. And now we certainly look in terms of plasticity. And then, of course, there are the extra robotic aspects of you can stimulate areas, or you can extinguish areas, or you can compensate for abnormalities. So it becomes more characterized, this whole area of neurological consciousness, but that certainly is one of the most basic and most important of the paradigms of consciousness.
Now, what intrigues me about this field is I would imagine that 98%, maybe 99% of all the neuroscientists of all the various neuroscience disciplines would think of themselves as materialists. They believe the brain produces consciousness.
And I see the brain as an end point or a sum point expression of consciousness in humans. In other words, I do not see the brain or this neurological consciousness as the only kind of consciousness.
Now, I know that the field of neurology regards Wilder Penfield as practically a saint. He's considered one of the founders of the discipline, and he was a dualist. He believed that consciousness exists independent of the brain.
It's very interesting. Wilder Penfield certainly was a doyen in terms of neurosurgery a long, long time ago. And he would do these wonderful experiments stimulating different areas of the brain during neurosurgery, which was quite appropriate because very often one had to know what area of the brain you were dealing with, particularly if you were going to chop out certain areas. And one was able to map out certain abnormalities and certain areas that seemed to produce certain functionings. And so when you start looking at somebody who says, hold on, I can map this out, and yet maybe there's something else called mind, it's very admirable, particularly at the times that he was involved. For example, there was a whole family of things that were happening thereafter in the 1950s, for example.
But basically, he would stimulate electrically a certain part of the brain, and it would trigger a particular sensation.
Right. And therefore, clearly, this is what happens. Well, it's a case of, if you're walking down the street and you chop off the leg, you cannot walk. And there the leg would be rather obvious. If you stimulate an area of the brain that causes you not to be able to walk, is it wrong with the leg or is it wrong with the brain? And it could be all the way through. And so neurology has, frameworks and synapses and connections all the way through, and we don't know where those connections are abnormal until we examine and see. And one can do this very, very effectively. But I would agree with you. Most people in neurology are therefore, this is the brain, this is the nervous system, this is all you have. And some of them are so extreme that you don't even have psychology because you're all chemistry. And your chemistry of the brain is what it's all about.
And the consciousness just sort of goes along for the ride.
Yeah, consciousness is that epiphenomenon, that expression in terms of brain function. And sometimes there are little dilemmas when you get patients where half the brains are chopped out, or where they are born with virtually no brain or something along those lines, and they behave what neurologically would be quite inappropriately. So, it introduces other areas, and of course the second one is the psychological consciousness.
Yeah.
And of course here you're not getting your range all the way through to deep coma and through to normal levels of consciousness. You're getting a whole range of psychological behaviors, because behavior is the ultimate expression, but you're also getting perceptions that are different. So we already start saying, if you go deep into the unconscious and you start probing and you become, let us say, a psychoanalyst, as opposed to your collective consciousness, and you become a Jungian. And somewhere along the line, if you were to draw this, it would be quite different. The one is down there, deep inside, and the other is, in a way, a certain kind of outside element. And then, of course, there are all those other altered states.
Well, the thing about psychology, as opposed, I suppose, to neurology, is that it's not a unified discipline. There must be a dozen or 24 different schools of thought within psychology.
As far as I understand, there are something like, well, there's several hundred different kinds of psychotherapy as a starter, and they're the subgroups, and people have written about 300 different kinds, 400 different kinds. It depends how you're interpreting this. But as you said, it's certainly not a unified component, and one goes through one's own gradations psychologically in relation to it. But one important one, of course, are the so-called altered states of consciousness.
Yes, indeed. And our friend Dr. Charles Tart wrote the anthology Altered States of Consciousness. It was a bestseller, as I recall, back in 1969. Everybody had a copy when I was a student on the Berkeley campus. It was practically required reading.
Yeah, and I've actually written about something like a dozen different altered states of consciousness. Of course, the classic altered state of consciousness is the dream state, or maybe the sleep state. And we've spoken about this, where one might even have some special insights or intuitions during the state, and it's not just a recovery kind of phenomenon. And dreams are certainly one kind of altered state of consciousness. And then, of course, there's the meditative states, but I use the word states because there are all sorts of variants in relation to it. And people sometimes forget that meditation can be a very passive phenomenon where one is letting everything flow in. Or there can be an active meditation. And in the Western kind of context, we sometimes neglect active meditation, which might be a prayer, but there is a term for it, and I haven't found an equivalent in English of that term, but the Hebrew term is hitbonenot. And it's active meditation, where it might be an active kind of prayer, an active kind of way of conceptualizing things. And so it's an interesting one, even the meditative states. And then, of course, there's this highly controversial state which for us is not controversial because millions of people have described it, the so-called near-death experience.
Yes.
But what is controversial might be what is the meaning of that near-death experience and why the variance. So there are all sorts of states like that.
Well, people in your profession of neurology, neuropsychiatry, and related fields of neuroscience tend to think that the near-death experience must be the expression of a dying brain or is somehow reducible to a materialist explanation, whereas most of the experiencers themselves come away and say, I no longer fear death. I know that there's another world waiting.
They have changed their whole conceptual set. Yeah. And that is something that is relevant. And across cultures, we sometimes see, not always, but we sometimes see the same kind of experience happening, which, of course, in neurology, one would say, you see, it's all a product of the brain. One is shooting out this particular chemical at that point, and it's producing a uniform kind of hallucination. And in another kind of sense, one could be saying, wow, they've experienced a new kind of reality. They've experienced heaven. They've experienced seeing their dead friends or their dead family, or they've had an out-of-body experience. Yeah. And these components, to me, are very interesting because you spoke about Wilder Penfield, and there's several different neurological descriptions of how you stimulate part of the body. And one of Wilder Penfield's classic stories is the patient saying, I'm out of my body.
Yes.
And then, of course, some of the work of Blanca now is busy saying, well, you know, you're out of your body, and that proves that there's no such thing as a real out-of-body experience.
It's a hallucination of some sort.
As if it is just one component. And one has to use that same kind of parallel of the leg and the nervous system going up to the brain, or whether there's something beyond that. And some of these people do not describe fully their out-of-body experience. I had the good fortune to, on a number of occasions, talk to Professor Michael Whiteman. I used to call him the 3 M's, the mystic, the mathematician, and he was a professor of mathematics, and very, very erudite. He was one of the most brilliant people ever to come out of Africa. And besides the mystic, mathematician, musician component, Michael would be able to induce out-of-body experiences at will.
He had, as I recall, a journal of thousands of such experiences.
Yeah, he went beyond 10,000. He would induce it at will. And I remember visiting him in his home in Cape Town one time, and I knew he had retired some years before, but he was this young-looking individual who would run up the stairs. He'd go and exercise every day, and he'd write and he'd meditate. And I said to him, Michael, how old are you? And he said, well, next month I'll be 98. And I quipped to him, I said, maybe your time spent out of your body does not count. But it does reflect something. His experiences, he used to call them separative experiences, were very, very different. And he had his own adventures. And this reflects the other side of this classification, because we've talked about the neurological, and we've talked about the psychological. What was Michael Whiteman and millions of other people experiencing with their out-of-body experiences? Is this different from the near-death experience? And of course, we've got our model of TDVP, triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm, and I see it in the context of a unified essence of oneself, but just at a different level. One is changing dimensional domain. One is no longer in length, breadth, and height in a moment in time. One is shifting there. And so that these experiences might appear on the surface the same, but actually qualitatively they're different and hitting different vortices and connections. And of course, this introduces psi.
Well, I would think, I've not gone through Whiteman's journals myself, but I would think that if you were to study these thousands of experiences that he had, you might find that they would map out these various higher dimensions of consciousness that are in your theory.
Yes. And this certainly does introduce a whole new component. Because as I'm seeing it, here we have our neurological consciousness, which we are all agreed exists as an endpoint expression, or maybe the only materialistic expression. We have our psychological consciousness, which maybe only the most extreme of the behaviorists are looking at chemistry says it doesn't exist, but the rest of us say is psychological, and we have our altered states of consciousness with that moving in. And we have, as I'm seeing, two other fundamental paradigms of consciousness.
And they are?
The two other paradigms are the quantized consciousness in terms of within the quantum, the discrete events that are happening in the finite reality, but outside the brain.
Yes.
And I've used different terms for the other one. Higher consciousness, infinite consciousness, extended consciousness. And I'm not saying these are all single units either. They go on and there's a transition. And you start saying, now, you have this consciousness. Is it a higher consciousness? Could be a lower consciousness, incidentally. It could be a growth. It could be a diminution. It could be what some would talk about as a spiritual consciousness.
Well, we've talked about geniuses in another discussion, and it seems that many times a genius will come up with a very significant, complex discovery, and for them it's as if it comes fully formed into their conscious mind from some other source.
Yeah, it's almost like a certain insight, that eureka moment, boom, and it happens, and suddenly one's aware of it. It might not be fully formed at that moment. It might be just the sudden intuitive flash, and then one might spend several hours trying to put together that intuitive flash, but initially it is fully formed. And you start saying, now, is the brain working there? Maybe it's much, much easier, instead of using that brain, to use one's whole capacity, this quantized consciousness, which is, I think, more controversial than even that extended consciousness. The extended consciousness that might come from the infinite, but of course the theologians would be most delighted about it, and the philosophers, be they mind-body philosophers with a dualism, or with the philosophy that we've postulated from our model, our TDVP model, unified monism, where everything is unified, but it's still monistic. We are still part of that same essential essence, and that essence grows outwards because it's not only an individual essence, it is, and I love this kind of term, an ethico-spiritual, bio-psycho-familio-socio-cultural essence. That's the short version. But everything fits into this essence.
Well, you seem to be saying that if you look at consciousness, we have, us, the small ego, the small individual, living our little life with our family and our home and our community and our
and
work.
With our little id and our super ego just thrown in to keep us fine.
And our dream life. But at the same time, it seems as if you're saying, when you talk about unified monism, that we are one with the whole universe.
Yeah, we're a unit. And that unit doesn't mean to say we are one with God. That would be one component of the whole laws of nature. That God would be an infinite component, and maybe all-knowing, some would say all good, and these are all areas of debate, all aware, all omnipresent. The point about it is, I'm not coming along and giving these attributes that were sort of given out by, say, St. Augustine or whatever.
You don't consider yourself a theologian.
I'm not a theologian. I'm a scientist. People say to me, do you believe in déjà vu? Do you believe in this? And I say, I look at science and I draw conclusions. And I'm therefore not, as a scientist, believing, but obviously there are prejudices that we all have in terms of perceptions of our belief system. But as a scientist, I can sometimes say the evidence for out-of-body experience, for near-death experience, which is extracerebral, for neurological events, for psychological events, for a quantized consciousness, for an infinite consciousness, for a consciousness with a growth and a potential in terms of good and evil. The evidence for those things
and I think
is very cogent.
You would also agree with me, I think, that the evidence for survival after death and reincarnation is also quite strong.
I would say, and again, I'm sticking my neck out, but having spent half a century studying this area in some detail, and of course the psychologists would say, you see, that's his defense mechanism, of course, but I would say the evidence for survival after bodily death is so cogent that it's as cogent as you and I talking today, and that the only thing that I would argue about is that maybe you and everything else in my reality is an illusion, and I'm the only piece that exists, and that means I'm a deity, and the good news for you is I know I'm not the deity. Beyond that, and it goes back to Descartes, where I think, therefore I am, and you can't go beyond that, but beyond that, I think the evidence for some form of survival after bodily death is so scientifically strong that it is totally proven.
Well, then put on your hat for a moment as the neuropsychiatrist. How do you deal with that from the study of the brain? How, if the brain is so significant in terms of consciousness, how does consciousness work when there is no brain?
Well, let me throw in this. Early on in my work, and in fact, I did a master's thesis on this, quite simple, Master of Medicine in this Department of Psychiatry and Neurology, looking at this.
Yes.
I looked at temporal lobe symptomatology, the temporal lobe of the brain, and it's the great integrator of the brain. And when it doesn't work well, it's the great disintegrator of the brain. But the bizarre thing that we found was that these people who were having so-called subjective paranormal experiences, having these experiences outside the brain, would have certain kinds of temporal lobe anomalous functioning. I'm not saying it was abnormal. It was different, and one could categorize this. And so one had this subpopulation of people with anomalous temporal lobe symptomatology, but who also were subjective paranormal experience, and we were able to compare them with a group of non-experience, and statistically this was overwhelming. Then we did the opposite. The opposite was, I took a group of people with temporal lobe dysfunction, with temporal lobe seizures, and I discovered that they also, statistically, overwhelmingly, had subjective paranormal experiences. So here's your question. How do you integrate the two? I think the area of integration within the brain, the window, at one point in one of my articles, I think I called it the window into the mind, is the temporal lobe of the brain. It's the great integrator of all polymodal perceptual input, the seeing, the hearing, the smelling, the tasting, the touching, and also these intuitions.
But if I'm deceased and I'm communicating to you or through a medium or something, presumably I don't have a physical brain at all.
Yeah, you don't even have a temporal lobe.
No.
So we have a problem there, and this is how this 9-dimensional model fits, because you're at a different level of dimensional domains. I'm not saying everyone who is deceased is at the same level. I doubt that that is so. And I think some of them might be very much linked with that physical reality. People use terrible terms like ghosts in terms of that. But the point about it is everyone has a different level. And I think some of that communication is not only communication of the living with the dead, it's how do you get through these dimensional barriers through into that physical kind of existence. And that is another side of it. That might be part of that infinite consciousness that I spoke about. But on the other hand, when I use that word quantized consciousness, I'm using it in the sense of the finite, but it might be we're made up of atoms. We're made up of quantal.
Yeah. Well, I have to assume, based on what you're telling me, that if I'm a deceased individual and I am able to communicate, let's say, through a medium somehow and make myself known, and we have examples of this historically, that there must be some sort of, I'm going to call it a mathematical analog of the brain that I'm able to use on some other dimension.
And it might be so. And it might be that some people are more able to, for example, use the temporal lobes of their brain in terms of that analog, the living person, of course, and that in some kind of way they are picking up information and somebody else will not pick up that same information. And on the other side, you have the frontal lobe of your brain, which is the great executive, and that is the great performer. And I think that might be highly pertinent for such phenomena as we call mind over matter, so-called psychokinesis.
Yes. Well, Dr. Vernon Neppe, once again, a fascinating discussion. I know we could go on and on because there's so many unanswered questions when it comes to consciousness and the brain, but this has been very stimulating.
Well, thank you so much. And of course, there are so many other different levels of consciousness as well. Yes. But this is very exciting.
And thank you as well for being with us.